And we're back. And Aaron, good to see you. How you been, man?
Not too bad, not too bad. I'm adjusting. We were talking before we hit record. I'm trying to get with this video thing. I got a new camera. The lighting's a little off. The new lights come in Thursday.
Yeah.
So I'm building out my side of the massive studios here with
Good.
new next generation technology, if you will.
Good. We are today. We're going to get into a topic that we've hit on a little bit. We've covered on various sort of news segments, and you and I have riffed on it a little bit, but really haven't dove into it too much. And that is sort of the other side of AI. We've talked a lot about sort of the possibilities and the opportunities and what gets people excited. What we haven't really dug into is, what happens if things go awry, if people have concerns about where it could go, and really kind of dig into, some of the regulation, or at least the thinking around stuff like regulations and so forth. So you want to kick it off and introduce our guest, longtime friend of the show?
Yeah, absolutely. So our topic today, by the way, is just AI safety and regulation in general. And I saw our guest do a talk. Actually, it's a couple months ago now at All Things Open here in Raleigh. And Cloudcast alumnus as well, having been on the show previously to talk about OpenStack and OpenStack Foundation, and now the OpenInfra Foundation as well. So we'd like to welcome Mark Collier, Chief Operating Officer at the OpenInfra Foundation. So first of all, welcome, Mark. How are you?
Thank you. I'm great. That All Things Open conference was great. That was the first time I've been to the conference or to Raleigh, and I'm definitely planning to make it back there. So it's a good event.
Fantastic. Good to hear. Yeah, and it has the distinction of being the only industry event that's local for Brian.
That's great. Well, you don't have to travel for once.
Yes, exactly. I don't have to go to Vegas, and I don't have to go to, any of these other places sometimes. So there's been a lot, and it's actually kind of funny because things kind of pop up all the time. And you'll see in the show notes, I put in a couple articles that's just from the last couple of days. But this seems to be coming more and more top of mind, this whole idea of AI safety, AI regulation, and the industry overall just kind of seems to be caught up in this arms race, right? Like, for better or worse, with all the different models that are out there and the foundational models, and who has the most parameters and who goes the fastest, and lots of comparisons. And, is that a good thing? First of all, right? They all want to go be a category leader, and they might have good intentions, but they aren't necessarily all open, which is something we're going to talk about. And this arms race may not necessarily be a great thing, right? Like, some people are kind of welcoming the AI overlords, if you will, and some aren't. And so tell everyone a little bit about both the thesis for your talk back then, as well as the problem we're kind of facing. Some people may not even realize it.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll just give you my opinion as we go here. So I think, first of all, competition is good in my view. So when we talk about an arms race between some of these big companies, to the extent that competition's kind of pushing the envelope and helping us go faster and make progress on this sort of fundamental technology or foundational technology that many have this kind of intuition. This is going to be the biggest technology shift we've ever had. And of course, our industry's at no shortage of hype generation, where, the tech industry is sort of goes in these drunken hype waves, and seems like we're doing that again. But I do think that there's something really to that, and we're seeing like actual concrete examples ever since kind of ChatGPT came along. So in the context of just lots of companies pouring money in and research in and competing with each other, kind of at a surface level, I think that's generally good. I think what you're hinting at is that some of the problems that can arise if all that technology that's being developed is not being developed in the open, it's not being shared in the open there, and you couple that with the sort of very real fears people have about this coming AI age. What does it mean for jobs? What does it mean for authenticity and deep fakes and all the sort of things that keep people up at night about this kind of accelerating pace of AI? I think all of those concerns, if not all of them, are worse in a world where we just have a few, like an oligopoly, basically, of proprietary players. And if this arms race means that you have to have $1 billion or $10 billion to build a model that's useful, and you're not willing to open up and show how you did it, then there's sort of three things I'll hit on that I think are a concern about that, or conversely would be much more positive in an open source, open collaboration environment for these technologies. One is just allowing more diversity of ideas and opinions and knowledge from around the world to influence the direction of the technology itself. So, who has a seat at the table? If you have to be employed by one of like 2 or 3 companies in the world to have an influence over this massively important technology, that to me is not good. It means we're not getting the best voices in, but it also just means like this concentration of power at the source, right? At the upstream of all this, where it's actually being designed and influenced. 2 is just access to that technology. So if the only way you can get it is to go to those 2 or 3 companies and, bust out your credit card and give them your data and some of these concerns that are very real, that's a problem. And lastly is just to the extent some of these are somewhat mysterious technologies, we don't really understand why they do what they do in some cases, or it's a little bit difficult to replicate sort of by design. They don't execute the same way every time. If you look like at LLMs, we need to give researchers access to what's going on to study these tools and understand what they're doing and why they're making the decisions they're making. So those are kind of like 3 things that get much better in an open access, open source world. And the concerns that people have rightly about sort of AI power and what it could do, I think all are worse off if we have just an oligopoly of proprietary companies kind of owning the whole thing.
Yeah, we've seen, I think all of us have been around long enough. We've seen sort of both sides of the, very proprietary world and technology. We've seen what open does, whether it's, creating new technology or act as a balance to it. You work, in a foundation, but you're obviously around a lot of people that are in the open space. Obviously there's concerns about things, and then you start getting into like, well, okay, how would we address this? And you've seen, you've seen some things from various governments, whether they're just statements or they're kind of beginnings of plans. We've seen some pushback around some of the early licensing that's come out for some of these models. They're sort of open, but not complete. They're not open in the way that. What are some of the big things that, as you talk to other people that sort of live in the open space and are thinking about, how do you rally communities together? Like what are some of the bigger areas that you guys are looking at? Not necessarily, all the details of how you would fix this problem, solve this problem, but like, what are the big buckets you're sort of putting ideas into to say, hey, here's the areas we should put more weight into, or try and encourage more people to behave and or to get engaged with certain things?
Yeah, great question. I would say, like, first of all, I would like to point to an effort by the OSI, the Open Source Initiative, which has gathered together a group of people, which I'm participating in, to kind of help create a definition of what we mean by open source AI. And the reason why that's needed, on the one hand, we can look at certain models like the Llama model from Meta, and it's been lauded by kind of the press at large as this great advanced open source model, but it clearly does not. It's not licensed under a license that fits the open source definition. So we actually know that it's not open source, and it's still an amazing move that they made to share this technology, and it's helping advance the state of the art. So I'm not sort of like throwing shade at it, but it literally doesn't meet the definition of open source based on the license that it's released under, because there's all these commercial restrictions. You can't use it if you're a certain company for certain uses. So I think part of it is just the traditional definition of open source, which is the idea behind it is I can take this source code and I can compile it, I can turn it into a binary, and it'll work exactly the same as anyone else did, or the original authors. And that sort of like concept doesn't neatly map to AI, because even if you have like the weights, for example, and you have the ability to kind of run the model on your own, it doesn't mean you can reproduce that model yourself, right?
Right.
And just to give you like, one concrete example is the data. Like what data was the model trained on? Not only is that information not published for some of these models, not only are they not sharing the underlying data, they're not even sort of telling you what types of data or data sources they use to train it. And that's because of a bunch of reasons we can get into around sort of legal issues, but
sure, copyrights and patents and all
yeah,
sorts of things.
copyrights, was it copyrighted source, et cetera. So this is a very tangled issue and hard to kind of summarize, but I would say that a big part of this is the ability to sort of reproduce the same model that can then reproduce the same results. We're a long way from that with a lot of these models, and so that under sort of puts a drag on the rate of change and sort of like the rate of innovation we can have if we're less open in the way we share how these tools are being built.
So, yeah, it's interesting for me because like I really like that analogy of if you built it as open source, you know, as a programmer code, right? But you have like, yeah, you've got the model itself, you have the weights, you have the data itself, and then you've got companies like OpenAI, right? Like OpenAI had good intentions and started as open, but you know, the company is anything but open these days, right? And if anything, they're almost like the early days of Uber, where they're just like, there's a couple links in the show notes just in the last couple of days, it's coming out like, where are they training their sources and what are they doing? And they're doing some pretty shady things, like, or they've been accused of doing some pretty shady things of like going to YouTube and scraping all the YouTube data because they're just out of data.
Right.
And so what happens when not only is it like, okay, you need transparency into how it was built, but you need transparency in how it's running over time, because people have said, you know, like GPT-4, for instance, you give it a question in the spring and give it a question in the fall, give it a question in the spring, and you get different answers because the training is drifting over time and the model's changing over time. And so how does, I guess where I'm going with this is like, how can open source really help solve some of these issues? Or do you just have a bifurcation of the industry of like, you have the transparent open source route and you almost have the closed proprietary SaaS route, and everyone just has to choose?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, like this space is moving insanely fast, and every day there's a new model, and some of them are open or quasi-open, and some of them are just completely proprietary. And oftentimes, another interesting fact about the way this is being developed, it kind of reminds me of the very, very early days of cloud, which is a lot of this is coming out of universities, out of research, fundamental research, and some of the for-profits, like, you know, Meta has a research group that's very influential in France and in other, you know, around the world, called FAIR. So you have this kind of research papers sometimes that are published that explain kind of some of the techniques that how something was trained, but not necessarily all the code or the data is released. But just to kind of, you know, more directly answer your question, how are people going to be able to, you know, decide between these different models? I mean, I think one of the things that ultimately comes into play is cost and sort of, you know, privacy. And what you see is most companies, they're not really in production today with AI, right? Like they're tinkering around with it. They feel they need an AI strategy, but for some of the companies that are starting to kind of incorporate it into production or commercial, you know, offerings, oftentimes what they'll do is they'll do sort of the R&D with like the state of the art proprietary, and then see, okay, for which use cases is one of these open source LLMs good enough, or we can fine tune it to actually make it even better for our specific use case than sort of the foundation model from a proprietary. And then there's a ton of hosting providers now that just do LLMs, or they specialize in sort of GPUs by the hour, inference as a service that can support kind of any number of the open source models. And so a lot of times companies, and again, it's early, so these patterns are, you know, changing all the time, but I think companies will actually, for production, realize it makes much more sense to choose a model that's less expensive if it's good enough for your use case. So I think we'll just continue to see this back and forth between the proprietary players and the open source alternatives. But I'm definitely not counting out open source yet. I think that it's the open source models are getting better all the time. And I guess just to drop one more point on this, which is, again, if you look at all these techniques and different ways of training and running the inference, what the researchers find time and time again is the number one determinant of the quality of the model when you end up, you're done training it is the original data. So I think that data and data labeling and sort of like creating open data sets is one of the things that I would like for us, as an open source global community, and the OpenInfra Foundation as one of the foundations that, plays in this space, to help bring people together to create and publish more open data sets that can be used to train new models. Because that's sort of upstream of what's ultimately the quality of the models in a lot of ways.
Yeah. There's been, I mentioned it a little bit earlier, but, we're starting to see a little more in terms of, government statements, if you will, or regulatory types of statements. We've seen the EU come out with something called the AI Act recently. Obviously, the EU has been a little more aggressive recently about trying to, kind of find a balance between sort of humanity and technology, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. space tends to be a little more driven by the politics of the day and so forth. Do you, like, as you're looking at some of these things, and you obviously you work in the governance space, so you're sort of not in the government space or regulatory space, but you're kind of looking at how they're trying to put things out there right now. Do you feel like there's any teeth to these things, or are these a lot of just sort of statements to put out there to kind of get reactions from the market and kind of gauge, a little bit like what you do sometimes if you're going to launch a product, you'll put some feelers out early on to figure out, like, is this generally going to be accepted? Is it generally going to go terrible? Do we forget something? Like, what stage do you feel like we're in as you're looking at some of these things? Are there governments that really want to put some stakes in the ground like right now, or do they feel like we still have a lot of balancing between innovation and what's possible, good or bad? Like, how, if you were advising people, is to sort of say, like, hey, keep an eye on this, or don't worry about it too much. Like, what's your sort of temperature these days as you look at some of the stuff that's come out initially?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I appreciate acknowledging that I'm not a legal policy wonk.
That's right.
So, I have kind of a layperson's understanding, but I'm definitely trying to follow it as closely as I can. And I do think, you kind of hinted at that there's kind of this dance going on of let's publish some things and see what the reaction is. I think that's kind of a normal process for these things. But I do think that if you look at some of the legislation that's been kind of drafted or floated, sometimes there's been a good coordinated response to say, hey, before you move forward and actually implement this, understand where this could actually be very harmful to open source and open source foundations. There was an example with the CRA, which is not really an AI related regulation, but it's more around kind of security and software supply chain stuff, where some of the early drafts would actually just kind of there was a misunderstanding. Open source is very hard to understand, certainly, and it's very counterintuitive. And there's kind of a misunderstanding of open source, particularly in a multi-vendor foundation kind of model, where lots of people and some who don't work for vendors at all, just individuals, want to kind of come in and participate, and sort of like the regulations not comprehending how that actually worked. And by the time the final version came out, it actually was dramatically improved. So I think one of the things we're doing is sort of getting all the people at various foundations or just open source kind of stakeholders to talk amongst ourselves, and kind of also put out more unified kind of education around what open source actually is, how it works, and how some of these regulations could ultimately kind of really cut off that supply of innovation. So I think that there's a healthy process going on, but I do think that there's one kind of way to think about the approach to regulation, which is, are you regulating kind of at the R&D phase, where people are creating these models, they're sharing them, they're publishing them, but they're not products per se. They're sort of like foundational pieces of technology, like a Linux kernel or Kubernetes or OpenStack. It's kind of a rough analogy, but basically, while we're all sharing freely to develop the fundamental technology, do we need to register that with the governments? Do we need to sort of force that down a path where, frankly, I think the big risk is regulatory capture, where you have an incentive, if you're one of these 2 or 3 biggest companies in the world, to go to the government and say, oh, we actually need more regulation, because then it makes it harder for smaller teams to kind of compete. So I think there's that side of it, is, are we going to regulate it when it's still kind of in the upstream development before it becomes a real product? I think there's real concerns I have with any kind of heavy-handed regulation in that regard, because I think it potentially limits who can even really influence this or access it to, this oligopoly of proprietary companies that are already some, trillions of dollars in market cap. So I think that that's very concerning. I think on the other side of it, if you talk about sort of an end user product that a company's taking to market and putting in front of customers and saying, we're going to take your money and we're going to provide this service for you, and then those products actually do some sort of harm or run afoul of standards or reasonable laws, that is, in my opinion, like the better area to focus the regulation on. And that's kind of how it's going back to sort of the CRA and just open source in general and product liability and things like that. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but generally kind of, I think the healthier regulations are on that side of, what's the end product, who's selling it to you. If it doesn't behave according to the way you've said it should, or according to the law, then that's a very fair place to kind of put the regulatory focus, in my opinion. I think if we choke off kind of at the very development of the model level, there's a lot of unintended consequences of that could be much worse. The cure could be much worse than the disease, I think, if governments kind of barrel in and mess up that collaborative model.
Yeah, I would agree. I think your approach sort of says, look, none of you have a crystal ball. So if you're trying to, trying to figure out what could be, you're going to get less things that you expected than likely. So yeah, tech is funny that way. It's not rational, like you mentioned. So interesting.
Yeah. So Mark, let's talk about the day job a little bit.
Sure.
What's new with the OpenInfra Foundation these days?
Yeah, so it's a nice segue, because these things are very much interrelated. So, Open Infrastructure Foundation, we host open source projects that are critical for infrastructure, like cloud computing, infrastructure for AI, edge computing. So OpenStack being the most famous of those, but also Kata Containers, which is a secure container project, which is, by the way, NVIDIA is heavily involved in, and they were speaking at this recent KubeCon in Paris about what they're doing with Kata Containers. And then Starling X is another example. It kind of it's everything from data center to edge, using both OpenStack and Kubernetes kind of behind the scenes and leveraging those. So we're still doing our fundamental mission, which is helping communities write software that runs in production for kind of the world's infrastructure. And kind of where it connects directly to the previous conversation about AI is, if you look at in the next 4 to 5 years, according to Jensen, who you probably all know at this point, $1 trillion is going to be invested in just building new data centers for accelerated compute. And so these massive data centers full of GPUs are going to be built out. And if you look at this kind of $1 trillion infrastructure upgrade over the next 4 to 5 years, it's going to need software to manage it. And we, of course, are there to make sure there are open source options and alternatives that the world can use to manage this $1 trillion kind of infrastructure upgrade. And if you look back 10 years ago, this is exactly what happened when AT&T came to our summit, OpenStack summit, and got up on stage and said, hey, as an industry, the mobile industry needs to invest $1 trillion in upgrading infrastructure for 5G. The industry, heeded that. And if you look now, 10 years later, 9 out of the 10 largest telcos in the world run OpenStack. So we're kind of seeing the same thing emerge. And, OpenStack's been around a while now, 14 years. But what's great about it is we just had our 29th release. So the need to continue to upgrade and add new capabilities to the infrastructure layer software, sort of the job is never done. We have specific features in the latest release of Caracal, which is specific to NVIDIA support, or vGPU live migration in Nova. There was some improvements in the Octavia load balancing service that provides a 70% reduction in latency on the network for this load balancer service. which directly affects sort of like AI and HPC workloads. So we see a lot of like actual concrete examples where the software continues to improve, and our Open Infrastructure Foundation exists, to help the community produce software that's useful for the next $1 trillion upgrade of infrastructure. And we see that coming down with AI right now.
Yeah, no.
So Mark, go ahead. Go ahead, Brian.
No, I was going to say, no, it's always fascinating to, like you said, sort of the top of the show, we, as an industry, we are fantastic at creating hype cycles. And then we, at some point we're quick to kind of dismiss stuff because maybe it doesn't, it doesn't excite us as much, or it's not getting as many headlines. And, you guys should be commended. I know at one point, Aaron and I joked, we said, what are they going to do when they get to the Z release? Like they're going to have to start over. And it's good to see that, that you guys keep cranking along on it. It's it was the hype, and like all good technologies, it becomes the thing that quote unquote is boring, but it's powering the stuff that we rely on every day. So you guys, you should be commended for that, and the whole community for doing that stuff. It's a huge achievement.
Thank you. Yeah, and just for those who don't know, we've always named the releases alphabetically. So we started with the Austin release in 2010 or 2011, and now we've had 29. Once we hit 26, we were out of letters and started at A again. So it's been fun. The community loves to vote on the names, and so we like to have fun with that as well.
Yeah, no, it's good stuff. I thought you might go with like things that had 2 letters, like Ann Arbor or Bali Bali or something like that. But, yeah, interesting. Well, Aaron, listen.
Yeah, there was a lot of debate about what's going to happen when we get there, and no, it's all gone smoothly.
Just roll it over.
That's exactly. Well, listen, Aaron, this is probably a topic that we're going to have to come back to maybe twice a year, 3 times a year, just to sort of keep up with stuff, because I think we're going to have this constant tension for a while of, innovation versus, again, AI always sort of gets pitched as innovation or technology versus humanity. Jon Stewart just had a long rant about it on the Daily Show, and regulation and safety and so forth are going to be intermingled in there somewhere. And right now it still feels like we, as an industry, we're sort of at polar opposites. You're either all in on there should be none, or you're sort of on the side of like, hey, there should be some, or whatever. So this does feel like a topic that we're going to need to come back to every 3 to 6 months, just to kind of get a temperature for where things are. So Mark, thank you for giving us some insights and some kind of bigger picture things to look at, and just some ideas of how to hopefully think rationally about some of this stuff, as opposed to kind of irrationally, as often happens in our industry.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was great talking, and look forward to coming back on the podcast again.
Yeah. Aaron, you want to wrap it up? Take us home?
Yeah. So first of all, on behalf of everyone today, thank you very much for listening. And we certainly appreciate your time. And if you enjoy the show, please, wherever you get your podcasts, if you can, give us a review. Also tell a friend as well. And I'm going to wrap up for this week. Channel. Yes, that's right. Yeah, now that we're doing this video thing, go subscribe to the YouTube channel as well. We're going to be posting this out there. So for everyone out there, thank you again for your time this week, and we will talk to you next week.